Welcome to the third episode of Innovation in Medicine. My name is Rafael Fonseca. I'm a hematologist and oncologist at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona. I'm also the chair of the Department of Medicine. And I also hold a Getz Professor of Cancer title at the Mayo Clinic. I'm also a visiting healthcare fellow at the Goldwater Institute. And today we will be talking about step therapy. And it's my distinct pleasure to have with us Professor Sharona Hoffman. Before we go into the subject matter of our discussion today, let me introduce Dr. Hoffman. She is the Edgar A. Hand Professor of Law and Professor of Bioethics, as well as a co-director of the Law and Medicine Center at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Professor Hoffman has authored over 60 articles and book chapters and has published 2 books. The first one is Aging with a Plan, How a Little Thought Today Can Vastly Improve Your Tomorrow, published by Prager in 2015, and also Electronic Health Records and Medical Big Data, Law and Policy. This was published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. She lectures nationally and internationally on civil rights and health law topics, and is frequently interviewed and quoted in the media. For more information about her, you can visit her website, which is her name.com, so sharonahoffman.com. Sharona, welcome and thank you. It's a true pleasure to have you here and very much look forward to this conversation.
I'm delighted to be here and thanks so much for the invitation.
Sharona, as I mentioned just before we start this conversation, we come from different worlds. You come from the legal world, I come from the medical one. But at the end of the day, the intersection of those two in our topic today, it's obviously crucial. It's of great importance to patients. I personally think physicians should know more about this. Obviously intersects with policy and also with the activities of insurers and their delegates. And the topic is this of step therapy. For those in the audience who are not familiar with this, step therapy is something that's a hot topic right now. There's a renewed interest in this because of a recent announcement from the Department of Health and Human Services that step therapy would be allowed for some of the Medicare Advantage plans. And it's something that I think physicians need to be aware of, and I can think of no one better to explain the implications, and particularly from the ethical and legal perspective than Professor Hoffman. So I wonder if Sharona, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about your background and how that leads you to this particular conversation.
Sure. So I have been a faculty member at Case Western since 1999, so coming up on 20 years. And I teach health law. I have a secondary appointment in the medical school in the bioethics department. And so I'm quite interested in all sorts of issues that have to do with health law, but also in particular in healthcare coverage and matters that affect elder care. As you mentioned, I wrote a book called Aging with a Plan. And so I have become increasingly concerned about how people get their medicines, pay for their medicines, and what laws relate to those matters.
Great. Well, no, thank you. I appreciate that. And, I should mention also before we get into some of the details, for this particular conversation, I don't personally come with any particular determined outcome for what this conversation should be. I started becoming concerned about some of the implications of proposals that would include step therapy, but realized, and ever more so after I read your paper, of all the nuances that are associated with this concept of step therapy. And I'm going to say, I think it's fair to say there's a number of people that are not familiar with step therapy. So before we go into that, would you mind giving us a little bit of background of what that is?
Sure. So step therapy is also called fail first therapy sometimes. And it's basically an insurer policy that requires patients to take cheaper drugs first and find that they are problematic or ineffective. And then if they fail enough times, ultimately the insurer might allow them to take the doctor's first drug of choice. So your doctor might prescribe drug X, the insurer will decline to pay for it and will say, no, you have to try drugs A, B, and C first before we're willing to consider that.
So sometimes I guess the name "fail first" speak volumes of how sometimes this can go wrong as well too, because what are the implications of "quote unquote" fail and what that means for a patient who's in need for a medication, right? But one of the things that is very complicated, I've been thinking about this since I read your paper, is that there are some things we do in medicine that maybe kind of look like step therapy. So as an example, if you have a patient that comes to you with a cough, perhaps a low-grade fever, a lot of people would say, well, we could observe maybe for a couple of days. Perhaps you should not use an antibiotic right from that precise moment. And some of that is accepted as medical practice. But a difference with this is that this comes from the coverage perspective. And I think a key element to this is that it potentially, the main goal of this would be that those perhaps medications that are per unit more expensive, or those medications that because of their volume incur a larger burden on a health plan, correct?
Correct. So this is a case where the doctor has decided to prescribe a particular drug, and presumably that is a thoughtful, responsible decision. The doctor thinks this drug is best for the patient, and it is the insurer that says, no, we don't want to pay for that. We want the patient to try one or more other drugs for cost reasons.
And I'd like to ask you a little bit more about this because, as we get into the details, obviously, doctors decide this is what's best. And I think you allude to your paper, that's not necessarily 100% clear what the best option is for a patient. So there's some vagueness, if you may, that even well-intentioned and highly competent physicians can have different perspective of what may be the best therapy for a patient with a given condition in a given time, which is obviously an important aspect to this as well. And then on the other hand, you have a group that will decide whether they pay for that or not, because they may not agree with that recommendation. I think that creates a natural stress.
Yes, absolutely. We do have a lot of uncertainty in medicine still. We have ongoing research. I think insurers are also sometimes concerned that doctors might be influenced by marketing, by fancy brochures or donuts that drug reps bring or whatever. And sometimes patients will ask for a particular drug because they saw it advertised on television with beautiful, happy people. And the doctor might be inclined to just fulfill their request and provide them with that drug. And so it's not necessarily evil in all instances for an insurer to say, well, try a different drug, which we believe, based on some scientific evidence, is just as effective. And a good example is generic versus brand name. So insurers might be justified in making that recommendation in some instances, and in some instances it is extremely problematic for patients.
Yeah, and I think that is probably the crux of the matter. The more I've been thinking a lot about this, and probably have done that more than anyone else, but there's sort of a spectrum in that, I think physicians could say, well, if you have a very chronic problem for which there are many options and you have truly equal alternatives, it would be really hard to argue against step therapy. So even then it can get complicated, but I'm just going to oversimplify it for the sake of the discussion. You can envision someone with mild hypertension, so just a mild elevation of the blood pressure. There might be several alternatives for a person that might fit the bill, might fit what's best for that particular patient in the physician eyes, and that could conceivably be done through step therapy. You take that to the extreme opposite of the spectrum, where someone is facing rapidly progressing disease, a life-challenging moment that, if a quick treatment and the right treatment is not instituted, that would result in just damage that cannot be reversed, or ultimately, worse than the death of a person. There's a whole spectrum between those two extremes, correct?
There is, but there are other examples as well that are relevant. So a lot of times an insurer will, or actually it's most often a pharmacy benefit manager, which is different from the insurer. So the pharmacy benefit manager is the party that processes claims and makes decisions about claims for pharmaceutical products, whereas the insurer often will either pay for them or handles other types of treatments. But the PBM, as they're known, the pharmaceutical benefit managers, will often select depression drugs for step therapy. Or what really got me interested in step therapy is personal experience. So my husband has Parkinson's disease, and after a lot of trial and error, we finally found a couple of drugs that work well for him, that enable him to continue working and living a pretty normal life. And then one day we got a letter from the PBM saying, no, we no longer want to cover this. They wanted him to go back on some of the other cheaper drugs. Well, you can understand why. There are a lot of drugs for Parkinson's disease, but we had already tried some of those drugs, and he either couldn't tolerate the side effects or they just weren't effective enough in keeping his symptoms under control. And that is extremely problematic for a patient, to be told, you finally found a combination that works and you cannot have it because of costs. Or depression drugs. A lot of people are very, very sensitive. This drug will work, other drugs won't work, other drugs will have side effects that are intolerable for the patient or just not be effective enough. And yet you have an insurer, a PBM, that is insisting that the patient get this drug and not other drugs. And so it's not always life and death situations. A lot of times it's the comfort of the patient, the functionality of the patient, how able is the patient to continue a normal lifestyle.
Yeah, and I think that is a great example. So thank you for sharing that. I know you covered that in the paper, but when you're exposed firsthand to something like this, you sort of understand, what the potential implications are for someone who needs, I'm going to say, the right treatment. And we have already said determining what the right treatment is can be obviously also subject to different opinions. I personally sit on that extreme that is more pressing, perhaps, in the sense that I am an oncologist. I actually specialize in an area called multiple myeloma, which is bone marrow cancer, and then we have seen tremendous progress. And that progress comes primarily because of the advent of 11 new drugs that have been approved by the FDA since 1999. And one of the challenges potentially could be in how that sort of range of choices is ultimately presented both to patients as well as to insurers. And we'll get into this in your paper. You allude to the comparative effectiveness research. Of course, we need that. And one of the challenges for anyone who's thinking about how do you implement the step therapy the right way, is that this needs to be with utmost care, transparency, and as much as possible to the best of the knowledge of those dealing with this, with objectivity in regards to that topic. Because and maybe this, but in medicine we all have different perspectives also on what's proper or not regarding expenditures in healthcare and whether a medication is quote unquote too expensive, whether there's enough value with those medicines, and that ultimately comes into play in how the rhetoric is sort of developed around those recommendations, and so there's a lot of aspects to be considered when one considers what the best choice is. Would you mind explaining to our audience also, how does it work? So practically, how is this implemented, and to what extent this is already something that we have with coverage plans?
So step therapy is simply the pharmaceutical benefit manager, I will call them PBMs, internal policy. They will select certain conditions or certain drugs, and they will say, you have to try A, B, and C before we will approve a different drug. So certain drugs are not on their formulary, are not drugs that they will routinely approve. And so a patient will simply get a letter or a notification declining coverage. Sometimes, as with my husband, it happens after you've already taken the drug and have been happy with it, and all of a sudden they'll decide to implement it. A lot of times patients encounter this. The employer changes PBMs because a new one says we can make it cheaper for you. And so that new PBM will say, no, we're starting over. You can't have the drugs that you were stable with in your old program. We want you to go through step therapy. Or the patient changes jobs and gets a new insurance program. Now, the patient does have some recourse. They can ask the doctor to request a waiver or to request pre-authorization. We've done that multiple times with my husband. And if the doctor is willing to, and this is not so easy because it's not work that is reimbursed, it takes time, it's a headache. And so some patients say, I just can't get my doctor to respond to this kind of request. But assuming that the doctor is responsive, they can contact the PBM and say, no, my patient really needs this drug. He was stable on this drug. We need to keep that. And hopefully they will take that into account and reverse their decision.
You know, that's an incredibly important aspect of this. I think about this dimension. So I talked about the spectrum between the life-threatening to the more chronic disease. But then it comes sort of, but I think you use the word gumption in your paper, which is just spot on. Because there's a gumption from the patient and the gumption from the medical care teams, because to some degree, you know, when I use my cynical hat, I'm in my day-to-day practice and we're dealing with pre-authorizations or requests like this. It really depends on, you know, how much energy you want to put behind that, often unreimbursed. And this becomes part of the care of patients that has to be covered elsewhere. So, you know, people have to hire medical assistants, nurses, secretaries that can help with this process, because it's quite an onerous process. And you know, and as we have seen recently from the news too, it's not necessarily one that kind of fits a parameter of you know, medical objectivity. You know, I may be talking to an obstetrician about a drug that my patient needs for myeloma, which again is a blood-borne cancer. And so to what extent, you know, that was a useful process or not, versus again, that cynical hat saying, well, to some degree, there's a little bit of attrition by fatigue, because just patients and their families, you know, just give up, and they just cannot keep going in that quest for that medication. It's something we face every day. I can, you know, tell you in our clinical practice, we have to design team approaches to this. You know, who's going to be calling the insurance, who's going to be sending the paperwork, etc. And again, it's all unreimbursed work.
Correct, and that is very problematic, of course, from the patient's perspective. My God, I need this medication. I need the doctor to help me. I need him to do it today. And from the doctor's perspective, it's, oh my goodness, more paperwork. I have 100 patients with these problems. How do I manage it? So it's a big problem from both sides, as you say.
You know, I'll give you an example. Just recently, we have been dealing with another therapy. It's a very expensive therapy for advanced blood cancers, called CAR T cells. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I'm not familiar with that one.
So this is a really like science fiction, where you take out T cells out from a patient who has an advanced cancer, and they're genetically engineered to go back into the person's body and directly fight the cancer. And the early results, a couple of them are approved through the FDA. The early results are quite encouraging. But they're very expensive, and they're expensive both because the product is expensive, but also there's all the ancillary care that patients have. But I can tell you, and just some recent examples, we can spend hours on the phone and scores of emails and other work, and you can see if in that chain someone gives up, the person will not get the treatment. In this case, it could be life-saving.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes, I have personally spent countless hours on the phone with the insurers, the pharmacy benefit managers. It's a lot of work, not only for the doctor, but for the patients or the patient's advocates as well.
Now, from, you know, I've heard this argument, so that, you know, we should be grateful we have a society where we have individuals like lawyers that help us navigate through all of this, because, I mean, the reason we have this problem is because we have this innovation, right? You could have you could envision you live in a country or you're part of a system where there's just no considerations of step therapy, but maybe the bar might be a little bit lower for certain things that are available to patients. Okay, this is what you have, options A, B, and C, and we see that sometimes in closed systems. So it's kind of a hassle or a nuance, but maybe a good one nevertheless. I'd rather live with that world where we aspire to these things rather than saying, well, this is what it is.
That is true. The upside is that there are a lot of choices here, and so we have something to fight for.
And one of the things that I think it's probably important to mention here too as well is that as you know, and our audience knows, FDA approved drugs, and there's the on-label indication for drugs, but oftentimes in medicine there are options for treatment of patients that are accepted by the medical community as standard that fall into this category of off-label usage of drugs. This is so important that it's been estimated in oncology up to 50% of interventions are off-label. Less so now with all the advent of this targeted therapies, but it has been an important part of our practice. And it's so important that physicians could be liable for not providing a treatment that is off-label if that's a standard medical practice for a given condition, right? But on the other hand, there's this sort of dialogue, well, it's not approved by the FDA for this. Perhaps it has lesser value or less documentation, and that's not that clear-cut from the medical perspective.
Right, and if it's not clear-cut and it's expensive, it's a good candidate for insurers to say we want step therapy, or we're not going to approve it because we want other treatments instead. So certainly the off-label use is a complicating factor.
In your paper, and just because you alluded to expensive, we have a little bit of history behind this regarding some examples where, step therapy has been used to try to control cost. And by the way, we have shown the paper earlier in our conversation, but we'll put the link below as well too. I highly encourage people to read it. But there's some situations where it has worked, and there's some that it really hasn't made that big of a difference. And I would argue one has to look at the total cost of care to know if your intervention is worthwhile. I wonder if you don't mind just giving us a couple of those examples.
Right. So very often it is worthwhile to try the generic rather than the brand name. Generics don't always work as well, but in theory they do. And so those are legitimate decisions that a PBM might make. No, try the generic, not the brand name. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence where step therapy has actually caused significant damage. So there's one case where somebody had ulcerative colitis. He was required to fail several drugs during a 6-month period because there's no constraint over how long they can keep this step therapy requirement going. And after 6 months, they finally said, okay, you can have your doctor's drug of choice, but it was too late and he had to have very aggressive surgery to remove his colon. He lost his colon. Another report is a woman with glaucoma was required to try 2 medications over 7 weeks before they would approve the eye drops that her doctor had selected, and she lost vision in one eye because of it. So lots of anecdotal evidence where this can be problematic. Insurers often care about the short term because they're looking at, well, if the cheaper drug works, we will save costs, and if not, they can always try other drugs later. A lot of these consequences occur in the long term, and so in the long term, healthcare costs might actually increase, but insurers don't necessarily think in those terms because they know people change jobs a lot. So when the complication arises, he won't be in my insurance plan anymore, or they'll go on Medicare. And so that's another sort of perverse consequence, is that the insurers do not always have an incentive to think about long-term costs. That's a problem for the patient, but the insurer hopes the patient will be gone when the problem occurs.
Oh boy, and that has no easy answer. I've thought about this extensively. It's a little bit like politicians, just thinking through the next election cycle, right? It's not the very long term that matters. And we obviously see the consequences of that. I think about the, say, with, vaccinations or, treatments, hepatitis C have been a good example. They've been proven to be cost effective, but if you're going to have that person only for a short period of time in your plan, it really doesn't make a lot of sense for you as a payer. Now, a counter argument to this would be ultimately we become beneficiaries for Medicare, at least with our current system, when you turn 65. So then everything, all the rivers flow towards that Medicare. So maybe Medicare has an important say on how, what's cost effective. But there's definitely not an easy answer to this problem, and one that I think we all should be thinking about.
Absolutely. In step therapy, people shouldn't think this is an esoteric issue, because as of 2014, 75% of large employers had insurance plans with step therapy. It's very, very common. Medicare Part D has step therapy. As you just said, some of the Medicare Advantage plans are instituting step therapy. So this is an issue. People don't know about it, but everyone should be educated about it because it's so common.
And I think it's probably fair to say that the extreme version of step therapy, not that it's necessarily anything we have right now, but could lead to systems where there's more closed formulary, where there's not even that next step. So the step kind of reaches a ceiling and it can't move forward from there. We see that, for instance, with systems like NICE. Where in colleagues who treat patients, say with a condition I deal with myeloma, they just simply don't have access to those medications. Now there's considerations that make them have that ceiling. The most common consideration, of course, is cost. So they use parameters that they determine whether that's something they would like to pay or not. But that's kind of an extreme example of how one could take step therapy. And again, there's ranges on how this could work. As you allude to, there's a large fraction of plans that already have that. But I think it's important, and just from the physician perspective, to keep this in mind, because we always, I think our job, and you make some comments in this regard in your papers, to try to do the best for patients. Certainly don't like to be burdened by the added hassle, if you may, of what we have to do to accomplish that desire. But I think people need to understand this, because as we think about the best utilization of resources, this could be, and certainly I speak with a greater hue in the area of cancer, could be a significant problem for patients too as well.
Absolutely.
So, in your paper, you talk about the legal and ethical implications, and that some of that was, I admit, quite new to me. I, of course, have thought about the ethical implications, not so much the legal, and I have some questions for you there, and I'd love to maybe first, push on what are some of the key concepts that you referenced. So one of them was transparency, and I guess this applies to any market, not only to healthcare, but you say that without transparency, it is nearly impossible to create a rational marketplace. You quote that in your paper from another work, and I think that, is there, can we achieve transparency when it comes down to choices in healthcare? And this obviously transcends step therapy, but it's a really fundamental question.
Yeah, so in the area of transparency, PBMs don't advertise that they have step therapy. When you get their pretty brochures, they don't say, oh, and by the way, you won't get the drugs that you're going to want. So patients have no idea about it. Doctors aren't thinking about that. And even if you look for it, a lot of their websites are very difficult to navigate. You can't find where they talk about step therapy. If you do find it, sometimes they just have vague statements, such as, well, we have a step therapy program, you'll find out about it. In other cases, you actually can look up your drug and see if it is subject to a step therapy program. It will have a little ST by it. But you still might not know the details. They're not going to tell you what drugs they're going to require you to take instead, how many of them, for how long. And so it's very difficult to know going in what the requirements are going to be. If the patient knows about it, at least when the doctor prescribes, the patient can talk to the doctor and say, well, I want you to know we're going to have to ask for a waiver because here are the drugs that are subject to step therapy. The doctor might take that into consideration. Now, that's a question. Will there be a conflict of interest? Because the doctor will say, well, this drug will be a little better, but I'm not prescribing it because I'll have to do the paperwork with the insurer. But I think it's better to know. It's very upsetting to patients to have the doctor make them enthusiastic about a particular treatment and make promises that this will probably help you, and then get a notification from the insurer that no, you cannot have this drug. And studies have shown that in some cases, the patients just won't take any other drug. They'll stop complying with any treatment protocol because they've had that disappointment and they've lost trust in the system. So, if people knew about step therapy, if they knew that this was likely to happen, I think that would be better.
How often does it happen? And I know there's some data in this regard that someone challenges step therapy or they go back and they say, really, I need this drug. And how effective are people in doing that?
Right. So I don't have a statistic about how often people do that informally with their doctors, but there are formal appeals that you can do. And the statistic is very low. That happens very infrequently. And so, maybe just single digits, so 1%, 2% of cases that people actually pursue all of the appeal opportunities that are available, because it's complicated, it takes time, you have to understand a lot about the process. But the studies that I've read show that when it does happen in those rare cases, people have a pretty good success rate, maybe 50%. So it's worth doing.
So one of the challenges, and I think you allude to in all of this segment of our conversation, is that patients need to be knowledgeable and physicians need to know this exists and they need to know what the alternatives are. I did an informal query before our conversation, so I asked a few colleagues, not all here, through my contacts, that I'm surprised how many of them haven't heard the term step therapy. And I pushed it to fail first, and a few of them, no, I don't know what that is. And so don't fall off your chair, but I think that's bad. We need to do more education in this regard.
Absolutely. I've given a couple of talks on this, and I always start by who's heard of step therapy? Nobody's heard about it, including medical audiences. So that's of great concern.
Yeah, you wouldn't mind. We need to disseminate this message. And again, I don't think anyone can claim to have the answers. I think your points are very well taken. That the payers are trying to find ways in which they make proper use of the resources and keep the cost of plans down. At the same time, it has to be done in an ethical way, a way that allows patients access to the best there is out there. So and so far, sort of the knowledge of how to make those decisions really rests on the insurer. And I'm not saying that they have the right knowledge, but they make the decisions based on the information they have of what's proper treatment versus not, which becomes incredibly challenged when one starts thinking about personalized medicine. So in the field of personalized medicine, a cancer is not a cancer. We're moving more and more towards N of 1, and we have taxonomy that help us understand disease groups. But as you well know, this has been broken down into incredibly growing number of subsets, which are relevant. They're not invented. They're important subgroups of different diseases. So how does that fit into step therapy?
Yeah, I think there's a tension because step therapy is boilerplate. It's one size fits all. You have to try this cheaper drug and then this slightly more expensive drug and on through the step therapy program. Whereas exactly, the current initiatives are all for precision medicine, personalized medicine, to try to find which treatments best fit people with particular attributes. And that is very contrary to step therapy, where it's just, we go by the cost and one size fits all. And so I think these step therapy programs have to be very willing to adjust themselves to whatever knowledge emerges regarding personally tailored medicine or precision medicine, because that's going to change the picture.
But practically speaking, it would require like insurance companies to have the depth of the knowledge that the physicians are going to have. And I'm not saying that in any self-serving way, but our fields are moving so fast. And sorry to be parochial, but in cancer, again, it's just such a rapidly moving field that an oncologist is not an oncologist. So I mean, to be fair, or to be objective, the payers would almost have to have just as good of a structure of knowledge as the providers have, at least at the optimal level of care. And that's hard. I mean, that would pose significant challenges. Again, in the disease I deal with, myeloma, there have been some attempts by some framework groups. There's a group called ICER that tried to come up with some recommendations for the treatment of myeloma. And they were fine from the economic descriptive perspective, but they don't fit at all what we do in clinical practice. And one of the biggest problems is just completely inconsiderate of this individuality of patients. Now, we're not even talking about the bleeding edge where you're looking at mutations that we're trying to match with new drugs. We're talking about standard of care for subgroup of disorders. I think in your paper you make allusion to the HER2 new specific therapies for breast cancer, and like that we have a whole range of options for the treatment of cancer patients.
Right. I mean, if this is going to work, the insurers should have tremendous expertise, and I think they could have at least a board of experts that they could quickly consult. And that's a reason to be very responsive to physician requests for waivers and to make it not very burdensome, so that physicians could make a phone call or fill out a very simple form and get the patient the treatment that they need based on emerging scientific evidence. So the more onerous they make it, the less able we're going to be to implement all of these findings that we're spending so much money to develop through extensive research.
This reminds me of a story of the Argentinian writer Borges, who, the cartographer with, there's this king that makes that cartographer start drawing a map of the land, and then it's never perfect enough, so he keeps pushing and pushing and pushing until no one can make tell what's land and what's the map, because he was so perfect, right? So it's almost like if the insurers would need to have that map to be able to live in the land of the physicians, one option. The other option would be a very close interaction with physicians, but it is sort of a conflict of agendas, in the sense that, well, the insurers might say, well, physicians may not be as careful because they don't have skin in the game of what's being used. So their clinical recommendations will not be considerate of costs. And physicians could rightfully argue in return, well, the insurers don't know what they're doing. They have no experience in the clinic. And I don't know exactly how we can resolve that tension.
Yeah, we probably can't do so perfectly, but as you just suggested, a lot of communication between the parties would certainly help.
Yeah, one of the other aspects that you alluded to, and I had not previously considered, is the aspect of discrimination and how that fits into our current legal structure, right? And that if you do step therapy for drugs that would treat mental health disorders, schizophrenia, do you do so at the same rate? And you even allude to the fact that they would need actuarial modeling. That gets really complicated from a insurance perspective, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, so this is, I don't think this is the biggest problem with step therapy, but potentially if they do select conditions in a discriminatory way, such as they have it for mental health conditions, but not for physical health conditions, there could be a discrimination claim under the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Affordable Care Act. They all have non-discrimination provisions. And so insurers just have to be thoughtful and responsible and select conditions where you can actually make a difference instead of in terms of cost without hurting patients.
And I think one of the things that insurers have to deal always, part of their pressure is public opinion, and whether they're doing something wrong. I think that's probably the most common lever through which insurance have to react. Otherwise, there's no pressure for provision that widely exists. So one of the things that we haven't talked about too is the level of sophistication of patients. Like in some cases, patients are incredibly knowledgeable about their conditions. With this, dissemination of information, I have patients that I know for a fact know more about myeloma than most or the average hematologist out there, because they're obsessively reading. Now, they may not have the background to necessarily understand all the medical terms, but they very clearly know what's up with the new clinical trials, what are some of the toxicities of the drugs. And I think many of them, the more educated ones, can tell when a medication is improper, where something else should be considered. So that's something else that also will come into play as patients face decisions that they're not necessarily making, but that they will know will not be necessarily in their best interest.
Yes, that is correct. Often you have to rely on the patient to tell you what's working for them and what's not working for them. And certainly that is true with mental health conditions, where it's up to the patient to say, I'm feeling better, my thoughts are clearer, my mood is better, etc. And with Parkinson's disease, which is the one I'm familiar with because of my husband, it is all about the patient self-reporting, saying my symptoms are sufficiently under control, I'm able to work, or I'm finding it extraordinarily difficult to work. And so that is in tension with step therapy as well, because the insurer might be saying, no, we believe drug A, B, or C is good enough for you. And the patient is saying, I simply cannot function on this drug. And you're going to have to believe the patient with that. There's no empirical evidence that you can use. There's no biomarker that you can measure. It's not like blood sugar. And I'm sure that is frustrating for insurers, where the doctor says, oh, my patient simply reports he's not feeling good enough.
I'm sure that's very hard. It's imponderable to some degree, even though you can develop tools for patient-reported outcomes and things of the like. But still, there's significant amount of subjectivity. But at the end of the day, it's very important. I mean, an antidepressant, how do you measure depression? We don't have a thermometer for that. So,
right.
so it just relies on the patient, reporting of those symptoms. So that obviously becomes very, very challenging. And some people are uncomfortable sometimes when we also use surrogate markers. People, in particular, people who are more critical of the private sector think like we need to have hard endpoints. But what's a hard endpoint with some of the things we are already discussing? It's very, very hard to know. Now, people will say there's validated tools, but even them, they do require the participation of patients providing the symptoms. I'll tell you, I don't know if you've heard this as you were doing the research for your paper, but I know of many physicians who've done things such as, using a medication for a short period of time just so that they can document that the patient is intolerant. And the game there, and it's not necessarily a bad one for the outcomes, but it is a game, and one could argue there's a certain level of, dishonesty, is that people will do that just so that they can get to that step, so they can get to the second step. And I don't know if you came across through that in your research for step therapy.
I mean, I haven't come up with any studies about how often this kind of gaming occurs, but it can also be very problematic for patients, because sometimes withdrawing from a medication, even if you've taken it only for a short period of time, can be very difficult. Again, with the depression drugs, that is true. You can't just bounce in and out of them, because people get head rushes, people get all sorts of symptoms. With the Parkinson's medications, some of the side effects are behavioral. Somebody might do something very embarrassing, lose his job, lose his friends, even if he was just on this drug for a short period of time, because there are cognitive and behavioral side effects. So you have to be very careful about telling a patient, I'm going to give you a drug that I know is not going to be good for you, and we'll use it to document that it's not good for you. It depends in what way it's not good for the patient. So sometimes you can do it with no consequences. Sometimes it is very problematic.
You know, I should have started our conversation by saying that the more I think about it, the more questions I have. I think you've put the light on a very important discussion, but it's obviously a conversation that needs to go on for much longer because just as we're going through our conversation, I'm thinking, God, you know, we have to explore this, and this is a new wrinkle, it's a new unconsidered nuance to the whole thing with step therapy. One of them, and you allude to in the paper, is just this implications of the laws Erisa and implications associated with the Affordable Care Act. For those doctors in the audience, how does that play into step therapy or not? If you don't mind just briefly explaining that.
Right. So there are some states that have step therapy statutes that are helpful. I think last time I checked, it was about 14 states that had step therapy statutes and a bunch of other states that are considering it but haven't yet passed it. So none of these statutes outlaw step therapy, but they put boundaries around it. So they'll say things like, if you get a waiver request from a doctor, you have to consider it and make a decision within 72 hours. That is helpful. They will outline circumstances in which step therapy cannot be implemented, such as the patient is stable on a particular drug, you can't take that away from him. A couple of them will limit the period of time of step therapy. They'll say you can ask the patient to try one drug for 30 days and that's it. If it's not good after 30 days, they get the doctor's drug of choice. So those statutes are helpful. I would love Ohio to have it. It doesn't. But there is a problem with a federal law called Erisa, which even lawyers roll their eyes when they hear that. It's a very complicated law that has to do with benefits. Basically, that law says that if the employer is self-insured, and 61% of employers are self-insured, that means that the employer is paying out of pocket for all medical claims. They might have Blue Cross or somebody else administering the claims, doing the administrative work, but they pay out of pocket. If they're paying out of pocket for claims, these state laws that regulate insurance don't apply. So even in those 14 states, the majority of employees aren't covered by those protective statutes. And so that very much limits the scope of the protections. And so then you have to go to appeals, to the normal kinds of appeals that you can have, which are complicated and which people usually don't do. So Erisa, that federal benefits law, has an appeals process. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, what's left of it, has an appeals process. Medicare has an appeals process, but it's a 5-step appeal, and most people don't do it. So you always have recourse. And by the way, any patient, no matter what state, can just ask the doctor, can you please contact my insurer and ask them not to apply the step therapy program because I really need the drug that you've prescribed. So there is that recourse. Then there are these legal appeals processes that are more complicated. So you need to be pretty familiar with the law.
Well, you know, and one thing came to mind, and I have been thinking a lot about this, so let me put on my clinician hat. You do mention in your paper there's an appeal process, and the recourse is there, but most of the time there's 2 outcomes that can happen from this. One is you can overcome a decision, so you'll have coverage of the drug. Now that sometimes is fine if it's not an urgent thing, but sometimes the delay in that process could, you know, put health at risk or life at risk in the worst scenario. And sometimes there's a recourse in which you would recoup costs that you incurred because of paying for something that you thought you should not be paying for, and so you get reimbursement for that. But here's where I think there's an asymmetry, and I was very, very interested in your thoughts in this regard. If I, as a physician, fail to do something or do something wrongful, Both personally, I'm at risk of my, professional licensure, and, there could be disciplinary process that would sort of impede me from practicing medicine. And also there could be some punitive damages, both personally or if I'm part of a group, to the group or the institution, where there's penalties for malpractice. But it seems like there's a huge asymmetry that the payers are protected from this. And I was, going through some of your references and did some research on my own. So let me just say, I find that unfair because, on the one side, you have both individuals and institutions that are liable potentially for a very large amount of money as well as professional risk. And on the other hand, the best you get is that they pay for the drug. So is that fair? I mean, what are your thoughts? I've been thinking a lot about this since I read your paper, and I don't know exactly how to get that together.
Right. So it's not fair. The insurance lobby is very effective, and so they're good at getting protections. But to be on their side a little bit, the law wants to incentivize businesses to go into the industry of insurance. It is a risky business. If you get a group of people that are very, very sick, you might go belly up because you're expending more money than you get in premiums. And so it's the kind of business that may not attract a lot of entrants. And so the law has given them some protections. You're not going to be forced to go bankrupt over one case, etc. So it's a lot of people think that that's very unfair. They have managed to get those protections, and there is some rationale for that because you do have to encourage people to go into the business when there are a lot of risks.
Sure. No, and I hear what you say, and the one corollary to this would be, what are the best mechanisms to provide insurance coverage into the future? I for one, and this is a whole other topic, I'm not a fan of us thinking about single payer. But on the other hand, these complexities are very, very hard. And, is there a way that we're going to, transfer somehow your insurance into more of an open pool into the future where you don't have someone who does benefit managing rather than just controlling that it's spent truly on medical expenses, but to some degree, physician and patients decide how that money can be used. I understand that's fraught with many problems as well, too. As I've said, I think at least 2 or 3 times in our conversation, I don't have the answers to this. It's a very complex problem, but it just didn't escape to me the irony of saying, well, I think physicians have a lot more at stake here, physicians and groups of physicians, than the insurers do. And as well, I mean, it's maybe not there's not as much of a high risk. This is a profession that you go in and, usually you have a stable employment, etc. But you do have risk of not being able to conduct yourself with an adverse, judgment against you.
Yes, that is correct. This is an example where the world is not fair.
Yeah. So, but anyway, I know at the end of the paper you make some recommendations, and I think a lot of them you have alluded to. But is there something else that you would want people to know or take home from this conversation? And I can promise you one thing: I think this won't be the last time you're called by us or by multiple other people to bring light into this issue, and again to try to address this from this multifaceted fashion. What else would you like for us to know about step therapy?
I think because the state laws are limited, they can't apply to self-insured plans, to self-funded plans. I think the federal laws need to have step therapy provisions that give the same kind of protections as the state laws. So it is useful to tell PBMs, to tell pharmacy benefit managers or other insurers, you have to review requests for waivers within 72 hours. We can't have indefinite delays. You can't take away medicine from people when they are stable on the medicine or when they've tried those drugs you want them to take and already failed in the past with a prior insurer. It would be good to define what failing means. It's one drug for 30 days or 2 drugs for 45 days or whatever. And just provide some guidance so that there's more certainty, so that people know what they're getting into. And if there is some way to make it easier for physicians to ask for these waivers, to deal with the insurance companies, that would be very helpful. It's very frustrating for the patients to have to make multiple calls to the doctors as I do, and whoever answers the phone says, "Oh, I left a message yesterday, he hasn't looked at it," and you're sitting there going, "Well, I'm running out of my drug in a week, I need it, what do I do?" So having more legal protections, maybe it's going to be helpful to just educate doctors about step therapy so that they understand what's going on and why they're getting all these calls from patients. But it's really critical for the patients to have doctors, or at least somebody else on the team that is responsive to these requests. It causes tremendous anxiety, and it's just very distressing to patients to get these notifications from insurers, and then to have doctors where it's a problem, to get in touch with them and get action.
There are definitely, some of them won't be invested. And I guess if there's any patient that listens to this, we have some on social media. I think your advocacy, self-advocacy, apart from what you do for groups, is so important. And I think we see that all the time. We doctors know that, there's patients that are a little bit more intense, a more squeaky wheel, and no matter what, at the end of the day, that helps their cause. And that, I think that probably is no different from medications. One thing, just before we wrap up, I wanted to mention, and again, in this spectrum, I think step therapy, in my mind, becomes more problematic as we deal with end-of-life care. One of the things we have found, which is really fascinating, and I will provide the reference to our audience, in the case of myeloma. So we looked at the real world data of patients that start treatment, and our patients sometimes can get 5 or 6 lines of treatment, sometimes even more, but there's a very high level of attrition between lines of therapy. So of 100% of patients who start with the first line of therapy, particularly in those that are not candidates for transplant, I won't get into the technicalities. For every line of therapy, we have attrition of 50%. Now, some of those patients complete their lives for other reasons, but some of them develop toxicity or die because of their disease without having the opportunity to having been exposed to the second line or the third line. And that really applies to step therapy, because there shouldn't be an assumption that if you have drugs A and B, it could be just as well to use A followed by B, when in fact it may be A plus B right from the get-go to be able to achieve the goals that you want to achieve. So it is very nuanced, and I think it's something that we all need to be working towards better understanding.
I would agree.
So again, just thank you very much. I really appreciate the time you've made for us. I actually have a son who's going into law school. I've been talking to him a lot about this, and I told him you should focus on this topic, because I think this is gonna be a hot topic for many years to come. But again, I appreciate your time and your willingness to help us with this episode, and I look forward to talk to you further. Before I let you go, one last thing: what is your Twitter handle? Yeah,
I'm actually not active on Twitter right now, so.
Okay, so no Twitter handle there. We'll leave it at that. But you'll see this as well too, and I'll send you a link posted in YouTube as well too, just so you can see that at your leisure. Thank you for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Okay, thank you so much.